Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. I'm Margot Weiss. I'm an associate professor of American Studies and Anthropology at Wesleyan University and a board member of CLAGS. As you all might know, CLAGS was the very first university-based LGBTQ research center in the US. And now that we are reaching our 40th anniversary, which I think is still pretty young, we continue to maintain a broad program of public events, projects, fellowships that nurture both cutting-edge scholarship and community building and connection. At CLAGS, we believe in providing free public LGBT studies for everyone, CUNY students, the many New York City communities, and folks near and far. This vision depends on people like those of you gathered here today, and your help is especially welcome in this troubling time when queer and trans studies in higher education is explicitly threatened. So please, as we start today, if you can, donate to our current end of year campaign by using the link in the chat. I think it's in the chat already. It is. But today I have the pleasure of introducing and welcoming you to today's amazing panel on the queer politics of solidarity. And certainly we need solidarity now more than ever. This roundtable is part of a year-long CLAGS series called Queer Globalizations. And as we start, I want to just take a minute to thank our co-sponsors, American Studies and Anthropology at Wesleyan University, the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium, Feminist Studies, and the Orphalia Center for Global and International Studies at UC Santa Barbara, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UMass Amherst. The initial inspiration for this series, Queer Globalizations, was the 25th anniversary of the 1998 CLAGS conference, which was called Queer Globalizations, Local Homosexualities, Citizenship, Sexuality, and the Afterlife of Colonialism. And that was a conference that was really ahead of its time. So taking the opportunity now to look back, but really, I guess, look forward and ask, what is queer globalizations now, today? We've had two amazing events so far, and you can check them out on the CLAGS YouTube. The September launch event on transnational and postcolonial queer studies and politics with Gayatri Gopinath, Martin Manalanson, Maya Mikdashi. And we had an October conversation on new directions in queer of color and decolonizing queer anthropology with Brian Horton, Scott Morganson, and Ann Spice. There's a playlist for those series, and this and our future roundtables will be uploaded to YouTube and shared there as well. And coming up next semester, we have two more roundtables in February and one in April. The ones in February are on provincializing queer and trans studies and Global South interventions in queer and world anthropologies. And then the concluding roundtable in April is on queer and trans asylum and migration. So you don't want to miss these. But let's get to today's roundtable on transnational queer solidarity politics between Palestine, the Americas, and Hawaii, and the intersections of queerness, of settler colonialism, and indigeneity. I'll turn it over to our amazing moderator, Debarati Biswas, who is the CLAGS board co-chair and assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at New York City College of Technology, CUNY. And she'll be introducing the panelists and getting us started. Thank you all for being with us today.
Margot, thank you so much for organizing this series and for giving me this opportunity to moderate this very timely and crucially important roundtable. I'm honored and thrilled to hold space with you this afternoon. We are gathered here virtually, but we are all physically located somewhere on lands that belong to and are stewarded by Indigenous peoples. I'm situated on the land that was known originally as the Lenape-Hoking, the traditional and the unceded territory of the Lenape people who were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over the course of 400 plus years. Unceded because the so-called sale of this land wasn't really a sale. But I want to acknowledge and pay respect to the continuing presence of Lenape people in their homeland despite settler colonialism's operative logic. I might be a queer South Asian immigrant displaced differently because of colonialism, but I understand that the resources that I now have access to and benefit from as a resident of the United States and as a wage-earning full-time academic worker have been made possible by settler colonialism and racial capitalism. That is, by land theft, wage theft, genocide, ecocide, sophicide, enslavement, extraction, and rape. I therefore endeavor to become a proper guest on the land of the Lenape people through my support for the movements for land back and reparations, and through my sincere and active commitment to resisting and fighting settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and all their tentacular manifestations whenever and wherever I see it. I would now like to introduce our distinguished speakers, and in the interest of time, I will only announce their name, affiliation, and one of their recent publications, but we will share their full bios and links to their books and articles in chat, so please follow chat for that information. Going alphabetically, I welcome Nayrouz Abu Hatoum, is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University. Her research explores visual politics in Palestine and focuses on alternative imaginations, people's placemaking, and dwelling practices in context of settler colonialism. Welcome, Nayrouz. Kēhaulani Kauanui Kanaka Maoli is the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Professor of Indigenous Studies in the Department of Anthropology and the Efren Center for the Study of America at Princeton University. She's the author of many books and articles. Kauanui is one of the 6 founders of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association and is currently guest editing a special issue of the association's journal, Native American and Indigenous Studies, focusing on Palestine, which is forthcoming. Donna M. Olwan is Associate Professor in Women's Gender Studies and affiliate faculty in Native American and Indigenous Studies and LGBT Studies at Syracuse University. Her research is located at the nexus of feminist theorizations of gendered and sexual violence, solidarities across geopolitical and racial differences, and feminist pedagogies. She is co-editor of Muslim Mothering Local and Global Histories, Theories, and Practices. Joseph M. Pierce, a Cherokee Nation citizen, is Associate Professor in the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literature and the founding director of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative at Stony Brook University. He's the author of Argentine Intimacies, Queer Kinship in an Age of Splendor, 1890 to 1910. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for accepting our invitation to be here. So let's get started. And I wanted to ask, given the panel's topic, queer politics of solidarity, I want to ask you, what does queer mean next to solidarity and solidarity next to queer? Like, what does queer plus solidarity ask us to consider, reimagine, strive for, given everything happening right now? In sum, what is the shape of queer solidarity now? Thank you.
Thank you, Debarati, for the introduction, and I really appreciate your introduction. It feels we share very similar, trajectories. If I feel like the background in my camera keeps shifting, so I'm sorry about that. There's some problems with the colors. I'm joining from Jahjage, from the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Kēhaulani Nation. It's day 426 of the intensified Israeli genocide in Gaza, within a larger, context of ongoing Nakba since 1948. I want to begin by exploring how queer solidarity invites us to think about it as grounded in non-reciprocal understanding of relationality. In other words, an ethics of being with that emphasizes collective and shared responsibility for liberation, what Kim Tolber refers to as being in good relation. This solidarity transcends transactional exchanges and emphasizes an ethical commitment to mobilizing toward collective liberation. I want to provoke a thought that many others articulated before me, like Hanine Maike, Lynn Darwish, Dana Olwan, Kēhaulani Kauanui, Natalie Kurito, Jasper Boar, Nishant Opadai, and which Ghaida Musa and I gestured in our co-authored chapter, Becoming Through Other, Western Queer Self-Fashioning and Solidarity with Palestine. And it is, is queer solidarity with Palestine a solidarity for all Palestinians, or one that is only oriented toward queer Palestinian subjects whose queerness is legible and identifiable and therefore worthy of solidarity? In our analysis, we argued that solidarity with queer Palestine often obscures and displaces the position of queers in settler Canada, particularly by failing to critically engage with their role as settlers within this colonial context. This critique aligns with the argument advanced by scholars who I mentioned before, and who have similarly articulated these dynamics, emphasizing the need for solidarity practices that is reflexive, contextual, and accountable to the power structures they operate within. So I speak alongside those who came before me and those who I walk along with, who insisted on breaking and exposing the colonial and imperial bind in queer solidarity. In the next few minutes, I will focus on one example that illustrates iteration of this approach. I'm drawing on the insight from Panay's Khosrow Shahi. I want to contextualize a recent event that underscores the limitation of liberal understanding of solidarity. The example of the 1 Million March for Children movement in settler Canada. And I'm happy, Dana, if you can also give a little bit background, like we can tackle the settler Canada question, I think, well. So on September 20th, 2023, Canada witnessed nationwide protest under the banner of the 1 Million March for Children. These protests, organized by anti-trans and anti-2S LGBTQ+ groups who opposed queer education in schools, framed their movement as defending parental rights and resisting the so-called gender ideology. Advocates for 2S LGBTQ+ educators and allies countered these protests, denouncing them as transphobic, discriminatory, and intolerant. The movement gained traction through two main organizing coalitions, organizing forces: Canadian white supremacist and right-wing Canadian white supremacist groups, and a multi-faith religious coalition spearheaded by an Arab Muslim leader who sought to rally support among immigrant Muslim brown Arab parents by generating fake news and, panic that your children will be, transitioning in school, this same kind of iteration that we hear also in the US. The protests were notably successful, with plans for another large-scale march in October. However, the geopolitical landscape shifted following October 7 operation in Palestine and the subsequent intensified Israeli genocide in Gaza. with the focus of these Arab, Palestinian, brown, or Muslim families shifting effort to ending the genocide in Gaza, the 1 million march movement was diminished and fragmented. The leader who mobilized the immigrant community, I'm not going to name him, anyway, indirectly admitted to the inherent tensions of the movement, discovering that some organizers are anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian racist. So the movement was basically shrank because of that. These protests brought to light some internal discussions among queer groups that Panez Khosrow Shahi explores in their reflection on queer solidarity with Palestine. In a piece, Khosrow Shahi recounts conversation with white queers who hesitated to engage in Palestine solidarity when faced with the participation of those who had aligned with the 1 million march. As they observed, and I quote, "It is one thing to be in solidarity with a hypothetical person out there, and another thing when that person comes to life in front of us. And it's far and is far from perfect." They argue that for many queers, shaped by capitalist conditions, solidarity is perceived as reciprocal and transactional. In this framework, they conclude Palestinians are not seen as having an inherent right to freedom from genocide. Instead, they must earn it by conforming to the expectations of white queers who demand comfort and visibility as unconditional rights, unquote. I want to end by proposing the provocation that Amira Metamayr suggests in her theorizing about Islamic charity in Egypt. For Metamayr, giving to the poor is mediated through God. Therefore, the giver is not expecting an exchange or a thank you, but might look for a brokered return mediated by God, like healing from an illness like healing from an illness. It is an ethics of giving that is not transactional, at least not in this world, nor oriented towards the perfect poor or the perfect victim. Might we think of queer ethics of solidarity that is mediated by a notion of justice and resistance to oppression that is not oriented towards the perfect allyship, but as relational, where one's freedom or justice in this world is intertwined with one another? A form that Haidar al-Muhammad calls an ethics of being with, that asks us to complicate an understanding of ethics and ethical life, which need to interweave relationality, interdependency, and incorporeality of human existence.
I think I'll go next if that's okay. That's really beautiful. Before I start, I just would like to begin by acknowledging with respect the Onondaga Nation, Firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Indigenous peoples on whose ancestral land Syracuse University and Syracuse operate and exist. I also want to say thank you so much to the organizers, to Debbie for the provocation, but also for the introduction, which as an immigrant to the US is particularly profoundly meaningful to me to hear, and in order to think about relationalities and solidarities between Indigenous and Palestinian people and imbrications within settler colonial, racial capital, and slavery within this continent as well. So I really appreciate your thoughtful contributions, and I'm really honored to be in conversation with Kēhaulani and Joseph and Nayrouz and be here today. I think I'm going to do the annoying thing of I don't really have an organized thought and reflection. And in fact, since the beginning of the genocide, it has been impossible to write or think beyond the genocide. So I apologize if the thoughts seem scattered, but I want to think alongside some of the provocations and also invitations that Nayrouz has offered us in order to think about queerness and solidarity. The question that Debbie has asked us about what is solidarity and what is solidarity next to queer, I think invites us us to do this thing of thinking about what is solidarity and what is queer, actually defining these terms. And I want to think alongside Jalil and Savjay, who have recently invited us to think about the ways in which queer functions, sometimes as analytic, sometimes as identity, sometimes as subject position. And with that, I want to think about queer as praxis as well. So I think like if we want to talk about queer solidarity or solidarity next to queer or queer next to solidarity, we might want to think about what queer presumes and what queer visibilizes and what queer invisibilizes. We might want to think about both the subject and object positions that queer identifies and defines. We want to think about the ways in which queer invites us to begin to analyze a gender-sex system, but how that gender-sex system already presumes a proximity or a relationship to a gender-sex system that has been defined and exported through colonial logic and slavery and enslavement routes, and also racial capitalism. So what does that mean? How do we think about queer when we want to think about what is happening today in the genocide? I think these are all questions that I'm not necessarily going to answer, but I don't think that we can talk about queer solidarity without actually defining not really who is queer or what is queer, but more like what is queer inviting us to actually do in terms of a praxis of solidarity against the ongoing, increasing savagery of genocide, of Israeli settler genocide against the Palestinian people, which is of course connected to past and ongoing genocides and violences of settler colonialism, both here and elsewhere. As queer theorists have told us, and as we all know, queer is not inherently liberatory. Queer is not an invitation to a liberatory sexual practice. In fact, queer and what is done in the name of queer is often the opposite of liberatory. We don't need to go and look very far to understand this. We can look to the example of an Israeli soldier planting an Israeli flag on the ruins of Palestinian people's lives, and the joy that is kind of like incited in that moment. We can think about Israeli soldiers invading mosques and singing and performing acts, anti-Muslim, profoundly anti-Muslim acts in the name of feminist participation in the most immoral army in the world. So we can think about those kinds of acts. We can utilize a queer framework to think about those kinds of acts without exceptionalizing them, without constituting them as aberrations, but in understanding them as part and parcel of the very gender-sex system that colonial power has mapped and exported onto Palestine. Similarly, I think if we're going to talk about queer solidarity, we need to talk about what does actually solidarity mean? What does solidarity in this moment necessitate? What are its political, temporal, bodily, spatial, and material logics? What does it demand? What does solidarity as an ethics and a praxis actually demand of us? What do we espouse when we speak of solidarity with Palestine? And with whom are we in solidarity with? And for those of us who are Palestinians, what is the work of solidarizing Palestine, and how does it position us vis-a-vis our own selves, where the self is not an other that we're in solidarity with, but an us, a we, right? So what does solidarity actually imagine? What does it demand of us? And I think lastly, I think if we're going to think about queer solidarity, we need to think about the difference between solidarity as an effect and solidarity as a practice. And we can think more about some of the ways in which solidarity has become performative and affect, and the ways in which it hasn't been grounded in any kind of material practice. And this is, of course, at a time when so many have been silent or silenced and afraid of actually articulating solidarity with Palestine, or refusing to articulate a solidarity with Palestine because of an investment in liberal forms of violence and liberal practices of sex and sexuality that often assume queerness or inhere queerness to particular temporalities and locations. So these are just questions that I want to ask us to consider as we think about what is queer solidarity. I want to kind of answer this question by actually centering the words of Palestinians speaking to queer solidarity. So a lot of discussions about solidarity today and a lot of discussions about what is queer solidarity have actually done the opposite. They have intended or intentionally or unintentionally centered the voices of those who are in solidarity with Palestine rather than Palestinians who are demanding solidarity from those who identify as queer and who claim to be in solidarity with Palestine. One such example of this is the urgent appeal to ILGA World demanding the rejection of Israeli LGBT groups' bid to host ILGA's next meeting in Tel Aviv, and the emphasis on canceling their membership. This is an urgent appeal that came out on October 29, 2024 from Al-Qaus and Queers in Palestine and Ballroom Palestine. So a coalition of Palestinian queers who have called out ILGA for its role in pinkwashing and participating in the pinkwashing of Israeli crimes against the Palestinian people. And I'll post the link to their article, or to their letter, but I do want to read a part of their letter because that is an investment in Palestinian solidarity and in centering Palestinian voices. Because every article that you can find about what had happened with ILGA has been a celebration of ILGA and a celebration of Israeli voices of those who called or supported the Palestinian call, rather than actually a centering of Palestinian voices and Palestinian insistence on their right to resist Israeli pinkwashing and their right to oppose genocide. So the letter in whole is actually available on this link, which I think I can drop something. I'm hoping that I can on the chat. And I hope that people read it in total. And I will just read one paragraph from it, in which the group says, the pinkwashing project led by the Israeli government and Israeli LGBTIQ groups has had a tremendous negative impact on our society and all our efforts to locally and organically fight transphobia, homophobia, and patriarchy. And they go on to name the effect of this on Palestinian society. They say, having worked against our struggle by promoting pinkwashing and harmful projects for so many years is one thing, and having the audacity in the middle of a live-streamed genocide in Palestine and in Lebanon to claim an international space is another. Promoting Tel Aviv, which is 70 kilometers away from Gaza, as a gay haven and a space for international celebration is not only ignorance or denial, but an international PR campaign to erase their active role in producing and supporting genocide. The letter goes on, and I hope that people will read it in order, again, to practice a queer solidarity that centers queer Palestinian voices from Palestine and refuses to highlight and celebrate international and global and US-centric forms of solidarity that emerge in response to Palestinian solidarity. And I'll stop here.
Maybe I can go next and let Kēhaulani to conclude that solidarity question, because I also wanted to think with the voices of Palestinians and queer Palestinians, and I was reading this publication, like a zine that was published by Pinko in collaboration with a series of other Palestinian people about sort of resistance of queer Palestinian people. And I think there's an answer to a question that isn't the same question, but I think that the answer to this question is also an answer to this question. And so this is, I'll drop a link in a second, but this is a series of interviews with Afif Nasuli, who conducted interviews by email and with a person named ES. ES responds to the question, "What have you loved about Gaza?" With essentially saying everything. And ES says, I have fallen in love with all that entails what Gaza is, especially the small little details of it. But if I want to be 100% truthful, I'd say that I love the beach the most. I love watching the sunset or being driven along the beach road at night and watching the horizon. And, you know, Nayrouz was talking about relations and relationality. And for me, there's something really telling and beautiful about the phrase, the small little details of it. I think that to me is relationality, to think about being on the beach and looking out towards a horizon. That's relationality. In some of my work, I try to think about speculation. Looking out at a horizon is one of the etymological definitions of speculation. So in this response, which is essentially to the question, what do you love about Gaza? It's not just everything. It's my relationships with place, and it's my relationships in an emplaced way that is also reaching out, looking out. And I don't know if solidarity means trying to theorize that. In fact, I'm sure it does not mean trying to theorize that. But to sit with and think with what all of the little details means in my life and someone else's life, and to think about what horizons are and mean in my life and in other people's lives and in Palestinian people's lives, and to allow that to be something that affects how I think about the world. And so I think I wanted to read that because part of, as Dana is saying too, what the solidarity can look like is not being the only one who is saying the things, is trying to find ways to listen. And if listening in person is not possible or online is not possible, then reading and not always having the answers for everything. I think that is solidarity too. Sometimes I think we get asked questions and we think we have to have the answers for everything, and we don't always have to have the answers. Palestinian people's answers need to be the answers, and ending the genocide needs to be the answer. And if I put this into the context of Native American studies, land back also means free Palestine. That is already the answer. And so for us, I think that is proposing relations rather than genocide, proposing relations rather than colonialism, proposing relations rather than racial capitalism, all of these things. And so, but it can also mean paying attention to the small things, paying attention to the small things that give meaning to the relationships that we have with place. That's what I wanted to say to that first question.
Aloha, kako, greetings everyone. Thank you so much for having me and for the labor involved in organizing this and the introductions, and also to my co-panelists and the moderator. I really appreciate being here. Am I coming in loud enough? Okay, great. I agree with everything that's been said, and I just wanted to add just a couple quick things. I want to first acknowledge that I'm also in Lenape territory and moved here in August, and I'm learning more about the ethnic cleansing, the forcible removal of Lenape peoples and also the tribal polities that are in exile, the survivors of genocide. In thinking about the question around queer and solidarity and what it looks like next to each other, I was thinking about defining queer beyond the non-normative in the way that it has been used in queer studies or queer theory, and thinking about to queer something is also to ruin something, and to think about, the ruination of the kind of colonial violence and what it means to be in solidarity, to be engaged in that work together. And so it really, the issue of praxis, I think, is where it's at, and to really expose the sort of transactional that's been talked about earlier, and thinking about what it means to actually move in tandem towards a similar goal, which is, the idea of solidarity, at least in definition, is supposed to be a unity or an agreement around a particular action or affect. I also just wanted to point out, I really appreciate, Dana, you mentioning the queer coalition that's calling out IGLA World in terms of the bid for the meeting in Tel Aviv. For those unfamiliar, that's the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association. And it reminded me of 2011 when the International Gay and Lesbian Youth Organization had decided to hold its General Assembly in Tel Aviv in December of 2011. And you see the repetition of it. And so I just wanted to, point to this as the longevity of what's been theorized as pinkwashing, really masking the genocidal violence against Palestinians by trying to uphold LGBT rights. And also want to acknowledge earlier work by panelists at a roundtable that Scott Morganson and I organized in Beirut. Dana, you were there at that conference at AUB. In Beirut. It was a session called Pinkwashing and Transnational Alliance. And I want to just tell you the subtitle because it gets at this kind of question around solidarity. It was challenging settler colonialism in Palestine, Israel, the United States, and Canada. And at the same conference, I had organized a panel on what I've theorized as redwashing around Israel, recruiting and masking genocidal violence against Palestinians by parading around Native American leaders and sort of ingratiating state initiatives in the Indigenous world in North America predominantly. And so seeing the connection between redwashing and pinkwashing. But what I want to highlight here isn't just to harken back to this earlier sort of activist and intellectual labor and how long it's been. That was 10 years ago. But to really call attention to the ways in which the United States and Canada also do this, right? And thinking about, this goes into some of the other questions that I hope we get to around not exceptionalizing Israel and not exceptionalizing Palestine by looking at the settler colonial connections. And so for me, the connection between a queer politics of solidarity, or what queer could mean next to solidarity, for me, it has to be about decolonization. And that's how I think about it. And to understand that is to think about the settler colonial context and the land grab, because settler colonial elimination is always genocidal, right? And we know that through the oft-cited work of Patrick Wolf, but also in terms of comparing the US, Australia, and Israel in his most cited essay. But we can also look at Palestinian scholar and diplomat and former PLO activist Fayez Sayegh in his 1965 work, Zionist Colonialism in Palestine. And I always want to lift that up, not only to center a Palestinian theorizing settler colonial elimination, but also note the year 1965. That's before the occupied territories after the 67 war. So that's somebody who is theorizing Israel proper as a settler colonial site. And I think this is really important too, because as we see in queer solidarity with Palestine, often settler colonialism as a term gets dropped here and there, but often interchangeably with apartheid or occupation, as though they're the same thing, without really being attentive to what it means to really engage the fact that this genocide and the intensification of this genocidal violence is part of a broader settler colonial project that is a land-centered project. I also just want to mention something that's come out in what was said before. around the fact that for those that paid attention or had the time or the stomach to look at the U.S. House hearings that paraded two different batches of high-level administrators, the presidents from select U.S. universities, to challenge them around student safety in the name of protecting Jewish students. Those were about the Palestine solidarity encampments, but looking at those hearings, which I watched, there were almost 4 hours for each one, so nearly 8 hours of footage. Those representatives, they went after settler colonialism as an analytic. They also went after critical race theory, or at least their misunderstanding of CRT. And also you saw they went after Black studies in particular and trans studies. And so this is how these are being connected, I think, is something that any kind of queer solidarity project needs to be attentive to. And then in terms of that part around, Joseph, to echo what you're talking about in terms of, and what was said earlier through the earlier presentations, I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly who said it, around what it means to actually have aloha or love when we're actually engaging in these kinds of politics. I want to lift up the work of Uahikea Maile, who's a Kanaka Maoli scholar who wrote, and an activist who wrote a beautiful piece called Let Gaza Change You. And I'll just pop it into the chat box in terms of really thinking about what it means to respect and lift up and center Palestine right now. And when this was written over a year ago, really centering what was going on in Gaza. So those are sort of my cursory remarks for now.
Wow. We need to sit with all you have said, especially the idea of solidarity as a process, to think about it. And also, as it is about speculating, it is a horizon that it indexes. And I think that's where we move into more the idea of queer as a politic, like tracing this horizon, this abolitionist possibility beyond our nation-oriented, heteronormative, heteropatriarchal thinking. So on that note, because you also were talking about our Gaza encampments on our campuses, I will fold in, two of the questions we had. And one was that, what does a queer politics of solidarity look like on our campuses and communities, often sited on unceded lands that belong to Indigenous people? And how are these solidarity movements or forms of solidarity writing, some of you already quoted, different from or similar to past solidarity movements, activisms, writings, or research? And the other one that kind of links with it is, it would be great if you can talk about what you see as the links and disconnects between Israel, US, and other settler colonial regimes. Like, what is the place of queerness there? And given your work on against the tendency to look at individual settler colonies and not always across them. So the idea of relationality. So take it away and yeah.
Kēhaulani, maybe we can go in reverse order with this one to think about across different contexts. For example, as somebody who is trained as a Latin Americanist and works across Turtle Island and Abya Yala, as we call Latin America, I think that there's been a lot of new work, and I'll shout out Shannon Speed here and Emile Keme as two people who've really done a lot of work around thinking hemispherically across the Americas. I think that that's a piece that kind of can get left out of the with all due respect, kind of wolf-centric settler colonial studies, right? That's not the same, right? But overlapping colonialisms is something that I think we're coming to appreciate more as a critical analytic, and that's something that I think can help us with thinking solidarity across different settler locations. So to not only think about a British colonial project, but one out of many types of colonial projects that are constantly shifting and interacting with each other and learning from each other and borrowing from each other. So for example, I'll just give one brief example. When in the case of Argentina, which is one case that I've studied extensively, when they were carrying out their genocidal campaign in the 19th century, the Argentine government specifically looked to the politics of reservations in North America as something they did not want to replicate. Too costly, too disruptive. And so the solution was genocide. And I think that, in a way, we can think about the use of state violence in the production of settler states, and the seizing of land as something that is constant and ongoing. But perhaps it's useful for us to think about how that happens at different historical moments and perhaps with different intensities, even though there's an ongoing, constant settler colonial project that is always about stealing land. Is that useful as a kind of, yeah, I'll stop there.
I think I might just chime in just to say around the linking individual settler colonies with broader settler colonial. I mean, what we're seeing right now with Gaza also, I mean, this isn't to counter anything that was said, just to add to it, we're really seeing, a US sponsored genocide. It's a US war on Palestinians. It's not just this complicity as people are talking about it. And also thinking about all the American settlers there, as well as US military that's been dispatched there. So wanted to also think about Palestine and Lebanon as sites of US settler colonialism as well, not as part of an Israeli settler colonial project, not just US imperialism in the Middle East. Might be something to talk about. I also just wanted to think about going back to occupation and apartheid. I mean, all of these things also, I think, we know that international law was created by colonizers to protect their own holdings, right? And then people have worked with it to try and actually utilize it. And so this is another issue. It's not just the limits of international law. We're seeing that even the states that helped create it historically, just a blatant sort of disregard. So I think this goes back to something that was said earlier around abolition and thinking about anti-statist forms of solidarity as well. And meaning, and by that, I should just, to be explicit, decolonization historically has often meant in an international world system sort of wrestling state power for those engaged in anti-colonial struggle. And I guess what I'm saying is that this is yet another opportunity to rethink what decolonization means that isn't working within state frameworks or with statehood as an aspiration.
Yeah, I really love what both Joseph and Kēhaulani have said so far, and I think there's two parts to the question, so I'll try and focus on the first part, like regarding the comparison or the comparative framework and thinking about making connections and insisting, I think, like Kēhaulani is inviting us to insist on, like, you know, seeing and understanding these systems as overlapping, but also distinct, right? And thinking about how we move towards decolonization. So thinking about the specifics of occupation, the specifics of apartheid, the specifics of settler colonialism, both in Palestine and in Canada, US, New Zealand, Australia, the other settler colonial or settler colonies. So I think, you know, what we have seen in settler colonial studies is what we have been offered is a way to think about, you know, the ways in which these kind of like sites interlink and like the kind of like foundational logics that are used to produce settler colonialism within each of them. I think that the settler colonial framework might help us think about the ways in which nativity and indigeneity are constructed as past, right? And we might want to think about how the past is actually present, right? In relation to, for example, the Nakba. Kēhaulani's work is really informative on this, but also the work of you spoke about Fawza Sayer, Rana Barakat's work in Past and Present is useful for us to think about how in addition to Wolf, we might want to think about the ways in which Nakba is never really over for the Palestinian people. And what we are witnessing in Gaza today is an ongoing Nakba that was never a site of past, but always a site of present. We might, you know, the framework helps us think about the material conditions of settler colonialism, not in a way that's comparative, but in a way that's specific, right? So that's what's going to draw in. That's why it's really important that Kēhaulani talked about the links between Palestine and Lebanon and U.S. empire, right? Like we know now that the the ceasefire deal that was struck in Lebanon invites and actually authorizes U.S. troops on the ground in Lebanon and further oversight from the U.S. state within Lebanon, oversight that actually means intervening in Lebanese sovereignty, something that Israel is also intervening in. The other thing that we might want to think about is the ways in which these frameworks can be used to interrupt investments in settler futurities. Of course, these states are premised in similar and interlocking logics of denial of Indigenous sovereignty, in land dispossession and Indigenous dispossession, in ecocide, in attacks on land, resources, and people and culture. That nowhere clear, like we can see this super clearly in what's happening today in north of Gaza, and this actually unmooring of Gaza's geography between north and south, and the production of Beit Lahiya as an exceptional site where dispossession is happening is an act of settler colonial violence ongoing. And with that, I just want to say that I think that what Native scholars such as Kēhaulani Kauanui and others have taught us is that, yes, the comparison is useful, but I think they have also cautioned against a too easy or romantic kind of comparison or comparative framework that too readily elides differences and or I think elides imbrications, right? So Debbie, you invited us earlier on to think about, you know, for those of us who are positioned as immigrants in this country, such as myself, right, a Palestinian immigrant, what does it mean for me to live on the lands of the Onondaga people? What does it mean for me to make money off of these institutions that are actually completely complicit in settler colonial practices of extraction, removal, and dispossession, not past, but actually present, right? And are invested in its continuance into the future, actually. So what does it mean for us to be in these spaces? So that's just, you know, a way to think about both the possibilities and also impossibilities, and the kind of both dangers and the material kind of like necessity of making these kinds of comparisons in this moment in time.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you all for really incredible, like informative insights. And I agree with everything you said. And I was also thinking about some of the names, like Rabi' Aghbari's piece on the Nakba as a legal framework. I think it's really useful. And I like how this space become like a space where we're sharing all these incredible texts, some of which I didn't know about. I think to link the question between settler colonialism and Indigenous solidarity, I was, you know, in answering this question, I was thinking to address it through focusing on kind of cross-Indigenous solidarity. So in both settler colonial context of Canada and Israel, queer politics is utilized as a tool to sustain and legitimize colonial imperialist order. And Dana Olwan, you've wrote about that as well in other, I think in Feral Feminism, where you also like gesture to the way in which Canada imagines itself as a haven for queer or gay refugees. Meanwhile, in most cases, rejecting Black and other Indigenous refugees, but positioning itself vis-a-vis other contexts, like, you know, it's a safe haven for Iranian refugees who are gay. Like, you had this really interesting illuminating text where you expose the pinkwashing and whitewashing. And also, I think Nishant Upadhyay talks about it with Michael Jackman in a co-authored piece. And to think about kind of the interlocking relationship between pinkwashing, whitewashing between Israel and Canada. So after October 7, Israeli officials, including the Prime Minister, framed the events through starkly colonial rhetoric, describing it as, you know, the fight between children of light and children of darkness. Palestinians were dehumanized as human animals by various politicians and military personnel, crafting a narrative that positioned Israel as the morally superior and legible within the language of humanity, while rendering Palestinians outside of this framework. And of course, we heard this before and continuously through the way in which other settler colonial contexts speak about and talk and relate to Indigenous communities. Queerness and gay identity were mobilized within this narrative, and it's exemplified by widely circulated images that Dana, you just mentioned, of Israeli soldier in Gaza holding a rainbow flag with messages like peace and love, or another image shown a tank adorned with a gay flag moving along Gaza, framing the military action as emblematic of gay liberation. So these images and messages sought to position the genocide in Gaza as a moment of queer liberation, leveraging universalized queer politics to justify destruction, displacement, and violence against Palestinians. You know, I mean, starvation, the list goes on, who were portrayed as inherently incompatible with these ideals, which, of course, as many of you have written and spoke already, these ideals are already colonial, like the way in which we think of queer and queer politics. So I would like to address this question also by centering Indigenous solidarity and the deep connection that have emerged in Tiohtià:ke between Indigenous and Palestinian liberation movement. Since the start of the protest here, we have received invaluable support of the Kēhaulani Nation, notably from filmmaker and activist Ellen Gabriel and the Mohawk Mothers. So Ellen Gabriel inaugurated one of the largest Montreal process in solidarity with Palestine on November 4th, 2023. It was during the ASA and MESA conference, and has continued her unwavering solidarity. On the first day of the joint encampment by Concordia University students and McGill students on McGill campus, Canada's first encampment of solidarity with Palestine, Ellen Gabriel welcomed us to her territory and reminded everyone that this land is not private property, but Kēhaulani land. This reminder was particularly significant as McGill University is situated, and they also say in their website, situated on unceded Indigenous lands. So the encampment also brought attention to a long decade legal battle between the Mohawk Mothers and McGill University concerning construction projects on campus where Indigenous remains were found. And this is, of course, happened like so many cases. Every few months, we have cases of remains being kind of found near churches or hospitals in settler Canada. Despite this discovery, the university prioritized the construction project over thorough investigation into these remains and exemplifying the ongoing colonial disregard of Indigenous lives and histories. The Mohawk mothers are still fighting back, demanding a truth and about what happened to their sibling and loved one, and opportunity, of course, to grieve. So on November 17, 2024, just a few weeks ago, 200 people gathered for a Haudenosaunee peace ceremony on McGill Lower Field. Kēnekāhaga women, alongside member of Palestinian Youth Movement in Montreal, planted a white pine tree, a sacred Haudenosaunee symbol of peace, to commemorate the solidarity between Palestinian and Kēnekāhaga nation. The tree was decorated with white and purple rocks and a wooden placard marking the site of Palestinian solidarity encampment, which had actually stood for about 75 days. However, by the next morning, McGill University removed the pine sapling. In response, Onogwe Gonongwe, women of the land, issued a powerful statement condemning this act, stating, "This desecration of Haudenosaunee symbol of peace is hate crime, and this is not reconciliation, and it's a practice of colonialism," unquote. So the moment, this moment underscores this ongoing, McGill and other institutions' support for genocide, genocidal settler colonial policies in Canada and in Palestine, contradicting this so-called, effort to decolonize the university, especially post-reconciliation in the Canadian context. It also highlights the profound and enduring solidarity between Palestinian and Indigenous movement on Turtle Island. And this also, for me, exemplifies shared resistance to settler colonialism and a shared imagination for what liberation might start to look like. So, yeah.
Thank you. But in the interest of time, as we open it up for audience question, I was wondering, as our audience think about questions and sit with everything you've said, it'll be great if all of you could, help us understand what keeps you going or inspired these days. How do we fight? This is something that we're all trying to understand. So it'll be great if you can help us understand that, really, the process of this South-South solidarity and its possibilities.
I think Nayrouz mentioned the beginning of kind of a protest movement in Montreal that was part of the ASA and MENA, and I remember being at that conference in Montreal and being at that protest, and I remember seeing so many young people. I remember seeing various academics. I remember ASA kind of sponsored a kind of walkout in which I didn't give my talk that was scheduled for that time, and I think just speaking for myself, I can't that type of action is so important, and for me, I can do that I can't do that all the time, I guess, for different reasons, and my body and my life and whatever. But I try to think about what do I have and what can I give and what can I bring to what skills, what utility and what energy and what gifts I have, and how can I bring them in a way that that is being a good relative. To be a good relative is the response. How can I be a good relative? The answer can vary, but at the core of what I think about when I try to answer the question, how do I keep going, is sometimes I have to shut myself in and I can't look at everything. Maybe that's a privileged position, and maybe I need to think about that. But also, that is an awareness that I have, and thinking about that and moving forward is something that I try to think about enacting what it means to be a good relative. That's the key. And I just try to keep thinking and remembering and keeping that at the core for me, at least.
Maybe I'll try answering. And I apologize. I think you can hear my kid in the background screaming, so I apologize for that. I think I want to answer that in two ways. One, it's profoundly difficult not to feel completely hopeless and undone by what we know is going on as I was prepping for my remarks today. And I'm not doing this in a cursory way. I'm doing it in order to insist on reading this and knowing what's going on. I was just wanting to see where are we at, with the death toll, right? And it's become kind of a habit to look every day to see where we're at. So this is where we're at. We're at and these are numbers that are gross underestimates. 45,000 people killed, including 17,492 children, many between the 0 and 1-year-old age. More than 100,005 injured, more than 11,000 missing. These are, again, all gross underestimates. More than 803 killed in the West Bank, 6,700 injured, 3,200 killed in Lebanon, 13,492 injured, in addition to the destruction of school facilities, roads, infrastructures, hospitals, ongoing attacks and reports of gender and sexual violence against Palestinian prisoners, against Palestinian women, not only loss of life, but loss of future. So what is there to be hopeful about in this moment? What can keep us going? Nothing but Palestinian resistance, I think. The fact that Palestinians continue to insist on living, the fact that people like Bisan continue to narrate their lives to us every single day, the fact that a child like Lema can, fight all forms of violence and speak to us and refuse and insist on living. I think those are the things that give us hope and also inspire our movements as people who are located here in the US. What gives me hope is my students, their insistence on refusing the violence of the Settler Academy, right? Recently, I read an article that I highly recommend by Rachel Silverbloom, where she talks about hope as refusal, right? It's this insistence. And she's talking about this idea of refusal is not something that's kind of naive. It's something that's actually very grounded in the practice to refuse, not only just refuse the present, but refuse a present that is predicated on violence as inevitable, right? So what does it mean, or how do we keep ourselves grounded? We keep ourselves grounded by recognizing and insisting that this violence doesn't become norm, that it doesn't become invisible, that it doesn't become silent, and that it is not going to be the Palestinian future. I think that's what keeps me going. Both the resistance that we're seeing on the ground in Palestine, Ghazans' insistence on living, and the emergent solidarities that have been enacted and fortified in relation and in community with the Palestinian people, both locally and globally.
Yeah, if I can jump in. Yeah, Dana, I agree with you completely. And yeah, it's been a year full of endless protest here in Montreal every weekend. And, like you said, Joseph, I can't go to all of them. Also, it's snowing here now, so it can get really cold. But still, families and students and elderly show up to these protests every weekend. And there is also escalation, different actions, like at Concordia University, where I'm at. The students are amazing and they give me inspiration. They haven't stopped and they're unstoppable, actually, despite all the harassment and the police presence on campus and all that. But also, I agree with you, Dana. I mean, at the end of the day, Palestinian and Lebanese who are resisting this genocide and ethnic cleansing are really at the moment, is my source of hope. And even, and it's interesting that you're mentioning these, Bisan and Lama, and I smiled because I know them. And it's we know so many people, I mean, almost intimately now, and then God forbid we hear about, their killing after, or but we know all these people. It's very, and I just recently I went to somebody's house who has an image of this grandfather who's holding the child, who said Roh al-Roh, And I think that image was drawn, like painted. And I looked at it and I was like, I can't believe we all know what is this image about and where is it coming from. There is this intimate relation, but I think, just to like not take too much time, I do think that the way in which also Palestinians in Gaza and in Lebanon care for each other, like insist on burying with dignity, insist of feeding cats and stray dogs, and insist. In Lebanon, the ceasefire went at 4 a.m. 4:05, people were jamming the highway going south. 4:30, they were cleaning the house. Like, you can't battle, you can't defeat that,
Wow. And incredible. I also want to, I agree with everything. All of that speaks to me in terms of what keeps me going as well. Palestinian resistance, student resistance, and insistence, as well as mass protest around the globe, and to really show that the world, the people across the world are standing with Palestinians. The governments not so much, but we see the split of which governments are and which ones are not. Just to echo the land back, the rise of land back, and also articulating Palestinian right of return as part of the land back struggle is huge. And I think what I want to just also say that I don't think has been explicitly named is one of the things that I think is different this time is that people are challenging Zionism as a political ideology. And I think that really gets to the root of what this is, in tandem with it in imbricating or undergirding the settler colonial genocidal project. The other thing I might just call attention to is, it took so long to get people to stop, to go from a demand for ceasefire to arms embargo, and thinking about really what it looks like for people to sabotage the transport of weapons, different workers around the world in terms of not loading them onto the docks and also intervening in different international waters, I think is huge, and is part of a broader refusal, as well as dovetailing with a broader BDS campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Up until recently, so much of it has been focused on product boycott or academic and cultural boycott. Divestment has been something that we've seen, at least in North America, within churches, and I think that is expanding in massive ways. And finally, sanctions, which has been the least, until more recently. So I think that is part of it. And it's another example of people citing international law, but that international law is not the strategy. It's just, it's a tactic to actually move something around the refusal.
Wow. Thank you. There is a question in chat, so I wanted to, draw your attention to that. There's a question which Natalie is asking, as an emerging scholar, I've had a difficult time finding conferences that are truly anti-colonial in an embodied and committed way. Do you all have any conferences, gatherings that you recommend for such purposes?
I was in Norway at the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association conference this most recently. Kēhaulani was there too. And I remember, and that's a fairly committed and progressive kind of conference. But I remember there was a kind of side gathering that was led by Sami scholars. That was really amazing. And I'm not sure that any conference, can ever truly be, what do we mean by truly in the truly anti-colonial? But what I found really energizing and beautiful about that NASA conference was the side conference happening that was led by Sami scholars who were grounded and were welcoming us to their traditional territories. So it was a kind of a moment in which a gathering was happening outside of the gathering, and that was actually where a lot of the sharing of information and solidarity was happening. It was not in the official capacity of the conference, but just outside. And I would, I guess the answer is that it may be happening just at the margin of the conference. Yeah.
Can I suggest one thing, which is, I mean, there are conferences that have academic conferences that have historically been more amenable to Palestine. However, that doesn't come without its own like problems and limitations. So I think one praxis of solidarity is for us to form coalitions to insist on making Palestine central to all conferences and organizations and spaces where the academy has been silent and or hasn't really spoken or tried to do kind of normalizing or equalizing kind of discourses around Israel, Palestine. So I think, you know, for those of us, especially those of us who have the privilege of, you know, continuous employment, tenure, we have to demand, we have to insist that these organizations center our voices and like center Palestine, but also do so by centering Palestinians and centering the voices of Palestinians, not people speaking about Palestine and Palestinians, but actually Palestinians speaking about their own experiences. And I think to go back to the first question about what is the praxis of solidarity, this is one kind of like material way in which academics can intervene in academic discourses and academic conversations. And there are also other kinds of practices, like, for example, in our pedagogies and in our classrooms and other kinds of spaces. So we can talk more about that.
Kēhaulani, do you want to say something about, you know, I don't know, where is this anti-colonial space? Conferences, beyond it?
I agree with what Dana and Joseph have already put out there. I think without knowing where Natalie Willens is based, I think so much of it is about also finding like-minded people in those spaces. And part of that is whether it's an intervention or an interruption or actually a collaboration in terms of where people are engaging. So I guess to get more specific, I'd need a little bit more context. But in general, I think the point is that I heard Joseph talking about is it actually may be happening at any number of venues. It's whether, you know, whether it's legible or identifiable and where it's happening. And then the issue around centering Palestinians speaking about their own experience, I think, is absolutely crucial, and pushing on established institutionalized conferences. I mean, what I'm seeing now are with different special issues of people trying to mobilize within different institutionalized fora, online journals, to really try to center Palestine in those contexts, but also in different conferences that are emerging to deal with the specific problematic. So, I mean, there's a whole range that's out there, and that to me looks really different than something like pushing on the American Sociological Association, for just as one example, to try and take up these issues. So I think it really, there's such a wide range and variation. It looks like there's a follow-up comment. Somebody's asking about PalFest, and then Natalie did a follow-up around the structure of commerce of conferences in enforcing certain logics. Deborah, haven't seen that name in a long time. Let's see, can we talk about the increases?
Hi, Kēhaulani. Sorry, I couldn't get my unmute button to work. Congratulations on your new job.
Thank you, Mahalo.
But I was asking if any of you wanted to address the increasingly chilly climates on campuses for speech that addresses, you know, solidarity with our students about this, or that tries to suggest that we should have seminar series, you know, discussing this, or think, you know, mini conferences discussing this. And I mean, the pushback from the administration is absolute. In my experience, I'm at a SUNY school in New York, and so I guess one way of thinking about this question is, how do you deal with that? I think about Dana in particular, right? I mean, yeah, you're an associate professor, but you're also Palestinian, and in an American school, right? I mean, what is Syracuse? It's not exactly a bastion of progressivism. I'm in Binghamton, an hour away, and I think it can be incredibly dangerous well, danger is the wrong word, obviously, in relative context, but it can be frightening how much the university pushes back and how willing they are to toss scholars to the dogs when we do speak out and try to talk about these issues and try to talk about these issues in terms of being in solidarity with Palestinians. Just any thoughts on that? I'd appreciate.
I think as a fellow Sunni employed person, one of the things that I've found really challenging is the fact that we are unionized and that we have a fairly large UUP union, and yet there's not a whole lot of willingness to really push for strong protections for speaking out in relation to Palestine specifically. And yet in New York, it's not the same as, say, Texas or Oklahoma, where state legislations are actively attempting to deny tenure or cancel student programs or departments. So I think that, again, this is a contextual thing, but it's also bound to the way that state legislatures are legislating speech to criminalize anti-Zionist discourse as inherently anti-Semitic. And so then we get to the issue of weaponizing anti-Semitism. And, again, Kēhaulani mentioned the kind of the Senate hearings and all of that. So like it again gets back to the issue of who is legislating speech, how is that being legislated, and also how in the overall climate of universities receiving how they receive their funding, how the people who are legislating speech are the same people who are legislating the funding that then is going to require certain levels of silence regarding Palestine. And thus the need for the union to step in and try to push for protections for these types of things. And yet it doesn't always happen. At least that's been my experience at Stony Brook.
I might also just add something to that. There's also around those House hearings, and prior to the House hearings, the ADL and Brandeis Center sent that letter to hundreds of universities, presidents, college and university presidents, with a thinly veiled threat that said, if you don't do the internal smackdown, you will be seeing lawsuits and challenging on the basis of Title VI in terms of not protecting students on campus. So there's that issue of the silencing in the academy, where you see these administrations doing that work because they don't want to be hauled out. They don't want to be hauled in front of the next House hearing, for one. And they also want to fend off federal investigations within their own institutions. But it is at a whole nother level that I think is only going to get worse with the next administration, as though it could get worse. And thinking about the state legislative moves that you mentioned, Joseph, I'm pulling together a proposal with a scholar right now for a forum within an established journal, and I won't mention the other scholar or the journal because it's only at a proposal stage. And it's to try and focus on settler colonialism, theorizing settler colonialism with and through Palestine. And one of the scholars that we reached out to, who's a full professor and is completely in solidarity with Palestine and has been for a long time, declined because even though they ostensibly have job security, are now under threat of losing their job despite tenure for moral turpitude. And I said, okay, I could see if you're at a bullhorn, using a bullhorn at a rally, and somebody says that they didn't feel safe with what your speech was challenging Zionism. But we're talking about a published scholarly work in an academic journal. And that person said, yep, it still applies. And so they literally declined because of this extensive scope. So again, I don't want to overstate it because I also don't want to take the focus off Palestinians enduring genocide right now, but to actually look at, these are part of the same political projects.
Can I add like one thing that I think you were alluding to, Deborah? Like, I think you're also inviting us to think about like the kind of the ways in which tenure fails to protect or who it fails to protect, right? So I'm thinking also of Mara Finkelstein's firing, right? Like Mara was just fired. She was somebody who was tenured, right? Ostensibly, she had the protections of being white and being Jewish, and even that didn't actually save her. And that was, you know, like when the university decided to expel her, what they used were grounds of thinking and talking about student safety. So universities are actually invoking this discourse of safety in order not only to delimit what we say, but also to ostensibly act as like the protectors of students. And meanwhile, we become constructed as aggressors against students. Why? Because we insist on refusing silence around genocide. So the terms of like who's actually like resisting and who's actually a survivor of violence and who's actually been violated is completely turned in an act that mirrors how Zionism and critiques of Zionism actually also end up being worked against in the university. So I just want us to think about that. I also want to think about like the instruments that institutions have in order to quote unquote protect us from bias and how those are also being weaponized in order to protect Zionist students and students who don't want to speak about genocide and who want to silence professors. Of course, the attacks are always gendered, always racialized, always against the most vulnerable. But what we're seeing is also kind of like an acceleration and utilization of the very same protections or measures that were ostensibly made to protect being used against those who need the most protection. So there's just a lot going on, I think, in terms of thinking about universities. And I really appreciate Kēhaulani's point that like, as we talk about what's happening in the academy, we must not get caught in like, and I think we've seen this a lot, right? Like they are making us get caught in thinking about the next move, the next policy they're going to produce, the next word that they're going to ban, or the next text that they're not going to let us teach. And all that is also made to kind of like deflect attention from the fact that people are being genocided in mass scale, that the genocide has entered its second year. And all of that is also about getting us to be silent and absorb the chilling effect of their actions and refuse to make the solidarities and connections that we actually need in order to survive right now and also the future that is coming. So just some thoughts. And I'm happy to connect with you, Deborah. We're very close.
Yeah, thank you, Kēhaulani, and you and Joseph, all for your comments.
Sadly, I have to do this. We are running out of time. I really want to go on because we just got to the praxis part and I feel the time ran out. But I guess it invites us to like really meet on our campuses, form those coalitional spaces, like more than conferences. If I've learned anything at this moment, what pedagogy looks like, what we are reading, what we are doing, those encampments on our campuses were learning spaces and are going to be learning spaces because the available structures are not enough. They're not doing it, you know. So thank you so much, all of you, for your powerful words, for inspiring us to do more, think about solidarity in different ways. I also wanted to thank our ASL interpreter, Marian Brown, for amazing work throughout this whole 2 hours, and to all our audience for being here, for sitting with us and thinking with us, and to our CLAGS volunteers, our board members who are here to help, and of course Margot, who made this event possible. Thank you all so much. I learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was just like life-giving. And for all of the resources in the chat too, just amazing. So much appreciation.